Now that you've watched that short animated video talking about intrinsic motivation and what really motivates us, we need to talk about some of the approaches that employers and researchers take. And I should start with the Herzberg's motivational hygiene theory. This is the theory that changed it all. Up until that point, everything was about if you want motivation, you better pay him a good salary, you better give him a bonus. And that's all anyone ever focused on. They didn't care about anything else. There was nothing about advancement and growth and recognition. There was none of that stuff. It was just about pay. Herzberg changed all that. And he did this with the motivation hygiene theory. And here's how it works. He argued that things that dissatisfy are separate from the things that satisfy. They're two separate things. And so he would argue the dissatisfier called hygiene factors, these things could never, ever satisfy you, ever. Things like policies that are at work, the salary you have, the working conditions, the coworkers and supervision. These things can only dissatisfy. They can never, ever satisfy. And so what he argued is that you need to make sure that you have adequate levels of these to ensure no dissatisfaction. So you want to have an adequate salary. You want to have adequate work conditions, adequate supervision, and that sort of thing. If they're bad, they become dissatisfying, and people are going to be pissed and move on or be demotivated. But if you spend a ton of money on these things, they're never, ever going to satisfy. So you might remember from the video you just watched, he talked about how you want to pay people enough to take money off the table. In other words, you pay them enough salary so that they're not dissatisfied with their pay. Then what Herzberg says is you want to focus on the satisfier. These are the things that motivate. Things like advancement, recognition, stimulating work, responsibility. So you want to have adequate levels of dissatisfiers, the hygiene factors, adequate levels of hygiene factors so that they never, ever dissatisfied. And then we want to focus on spending our money and our time focusing on the motivators. These things can only satisfy. They can never, ever dissatisfy, ever, according to Herzberg. Now, you may not disagree with that, or you may disagree with that. And there is some criticism of the model because it doesn't really take into effect individual differences. So I look at this list of satisfiers here, and I think about someone like my dad. My dad was a letter carrier his whole life, and he had many opportunities to advance in the Postal Service, but he never wanted to be the boss of his friends. And so for him, my dad, this motivation hygiene theory breaks down because he was not motivated by advancement. He didn't care about recognition and being recognized for good work. And he definitely didn't want responsibility. He just wanted to deliver the mail and then go home to his family at the end of the day. He didn't want to have all the responsibilities of being a boss. And so for him, this theory breaks down. But this is the model that changed everything. It's because of Herzberg that you now have companies that focus on things like stimulating work, making sure you like your job, recognizing you for good performance, whether it be a pat on the back, a certificate, or a bonus, whatever the case may be. These are things resulted from Herzberg's kind of approach. And then the job characteristic theory took it to a whole nother level. And again, we're talking about how can you make the job, design the job so it's more intrinsically motivating. And if you can do that, you're going to get people that work because they love what they do. And again, imagine any time that you've ever been lucky enough to have a job where you loved what you did. You work so much harder because you liked what you did. This is what you want for your employees. This is what you want for your teammates. And this is how you get it. You need to focus on these core job characteristics. And you learned a little bit about these from the article you read for today and from the self-assessment you took, the job diagnostic survey. It measured your level for your current job about how you felt about these 5 core job characteristics. The first one is skill variety. This is the degree to which your job requires you to use a variety of different skills. So it's not just one thing over and over and over again all day. It's a little bit of everything. And the idea is the more that you're able to use your different skills that you have, the more satisfying the job will be, the more motivated it will be. Number 2 is task identity. This is the degree to which the job allows you to see something from the beginning until the end. It's not just coming in and say you're on an assembly line where something goes by you and you screw a bolt on, and that's all you do all day. You don't see the beginning of the project. You don't see the end of the project. You just see your part. Task identity is seeing something from the beginning to the end. And the more you can do that in your job, the more meaningful and satisfying it becomes. Now, Harley-Davidson is kind of a classic example of this here. Prior to, I don't remember if it was the 1980s or 1990s, they just had a regular assembly line when they were making their motorcycles where the motorcycles would come through and you'd do your part. If you were the brake guy, you just did the brake. That's all you did. They changed it where they created these teams of individuals that would create the entire motorcycle from the ground up. And so you and your team would build the entire motorcycle. You'd see it from the beginning to when you saw it at the end. So they had very high task identity when they changed things. Task significance. This is the degree to which you feel your job is important, that it makes a difference. And that make a difference kind of feeling might be for the company. So for example, at Ford Credit, did my job have a big meaning? Was it significant in the big realm and scheme of Ford Credit? But it could also mean how important is your job, if this is important to you, to the larger society. Some of us want to have a job that has a purpose, a meaning, that makes a difference in the lives of other people. This could also be task significance. And those 3 things together, they give your job meaning. And this is what that video was talking about, the idea of purpose. These kind of things get at that. Then you have autonomy. Autonomy is this idea that you have the decision to decide how you're going to do something, when you're going to do it, all that sort of thing. You have a lot of freedom to decide how to organize your day. Then you have feedback from the job. Feedback from the job, again, it could be from the job itself. So maybe you have some kind of automated system where you can see how you're progressing, or it could be feedback from the boss. And so if you're the boss of someone, you have to provide this feedback. And these 5 areas give the critical psychological stage, which results in intrinsic motivation. Now, for this model to work, you need to have these things. The model falls apart if these things in the bottom, knowledge and skill, growth needs strength, and context satisfaction, are missing. If they're gone, this model doesn't work. So you have to have the knowledge and skill to do the job. So when Harley-Davidson changed from an assembly line to a team building kind of approach to building their motorcycles, they gave a lot of training because before maybe I was just the brake person. I didn't know how to do all the stuff on the engine and all that sort of thing. I had to be trained on that. And so we made sure we had all the knowledge and skills to be able to build these motorcycles from the ground up. You also have to have growth needs strength. Growth needs strength is a personality variable that gets at, do you want to be challenged? Do you want to grow and develop? Not everyone does. You think back to my dad and my example I gave for him. He had very low growth needs strength. He was happy with just doing his job, getting his paycheck, and going home. He didn't want advancement and recognition and growth. That was not interesting to him. And then finally, you also have to have context satisfaction. This gets back to Herzberg's hygiene factors. If you're not satisfied with your working conditions, with your boss, with your teammates, this model falls apart. You can't design a job to overcome bad working conditions. And so if you work in a place that has no air conditioning, or you have really a bully or abusive boss working with you, that's going to really decrease your intrinsic motivation. And no matter how well the job is designed, things fall apart. What I want you to do now is I want you to stop the video and I want you to look at your results from the job diagnostic survey that you took. And I want you to try to enrich your current job. And so every job has this motivational potential score. And so you take your score that you gave yourself on task variety or skill variety, you give it on task identity, task significance, you divide that by 3, and then you multiply it times the score you received on autonomy and feedback. And that gives you the motivation potential of your current job. And I want you to stop the video, and I want you to try to think about how you can specifically enrich your own job. And again, that's the beauty of job design and intrinsic motivation. You can do it yourself, or you can do it for your team or your employees as their boss. This is something that you can make a huge difference in the intrinsic motivation of someone. So take a moment, stop the video, think about what you might be able to do in your own current job to make it just a little bit more intrinsically motivating. After you're done with that, continue the video, and I'll give you an example using my own jobs. So here is the job I've talked about a couple times in these broadcasts here. One of my first jobs I had out of college was with Ford Credit. And if you look at how I scored that job, I gave it these various skills. For skill variety, the degree to which the job required me to use a variety of my different skills, I kind of gave it a medium score. It wasn't terrible on that, but it wasn't great. Task identity, the degree to which the job requires seeing something from the beginning to the end. I scored that very low. And the reason being is once I did something, it would be turned over to someone else. So for example, if I was approving auto loans for people like you that were applying for a loan through a car dealer, if I approved that loan, I'd never see what happened to it. If I was doing some kind of dealer loan or dealer financing option, I would start the process, and then my boss and then Detroit and Dearborn would take over from there. So I never saw something from the beginning to the end. I also had very, very low task significance. Inside Ford Credit, I could never see how my job made much of a difference to the larger Ford Credit empire. What was my little job doing in terms of that? But in addition, I always wanted to have a larger purpose, like I was making a small difference in the lives of other people or society. And I felt like what I was doing for Ford, yes, maybe I'm making a little money for them, but am I making a difference in the lives of other people? For me, personally, I was not. And so I gave that a very low score. Then on autonomy, I didn't have a lot of freedom to decide how I organized my day, what I would do, who I would see, what I had to work on. That was very, very controlled by my boss. And I didn't like that. And then finally, feedback was very, very low. I didn't get feedback from the job, and I definitely didn't get enough feedback from my boss. And so you can see my motivation potential score was a 9.33 if you do this calculation. Now, the question is, if you're my boss, what can you do to help me perceive my job or make my job more intrinsically motivating? Well, if you look at this, we have a problem with task significance. That's a huge problem. We have a problem with autonomy, and we have a problem with feedback. You could also argue we have a problem with task identity, but with the number of rules and procedures that were in place at a big company like Ford Credit, they probably couldn't change things where I could see things more from the beginning to the end, and that's why I didn't circle it. But let's look at what we can do here. Task significance. Again, I gave it a 1 out of 7. Very, very low. How, as my boss, could you make me see that what I do is important? One of the articles you read for today kind of got at that a little bit. But you definitely can. And so, again, I was sitting at Ford. I'm like, what difference do I make at Ford Credit? What difference do I make in the larger society? My boss could have definitely changed my perception of my task significance. He could have pointed out about how my work was critical to the success of that branch of Ford Credit sitting there in Waterloo, Iowa, that my job was important to the success of that branch and it would be terrible without it. In terms of the larger society, he could say, look, when you're approving loans for people, maybe you're helping them get loans that no other people will give. You're helping them get a car, which then helps them get to their job, which helps them put food on the table, all this kind of stuff. So there were many things he could have pointed out that would have increased my task significance, which would have raised my overall motivational potential score over here. Again, we may not ever get it to the maximum, but if we could get this a little bit higher, that's going to raise up as well. Then autonomy and feedback. Autonomy, again, was only a 2 out of 7. I had very little freedom. And I understand that when I started, my boss had to be a little bit more controlling. But he could have released the reins a little bit and had me decide more about how I was going to organize my day, who I was going to go talk to, how I would focus on my discussions with the dealers and that sort of thing. And that would have raised my autonomy score. And he definitely could have changed the feedback. He could have provided much more feedback on how I was doing, what I could do to improve, that sort of thing. And again, all of this would have helped raise this score. And so I would have been maybe not a ton more intrinsically motivated, but a little bit. Now, let's look at my current job. My job as a professor scores the maximum because I believe I have the best job in the world. I'm incredibly intrinsically motivated and satisfied with what I do. And if you look at the job design survey and the job characteristic model, you can see why that is. So for skill variety, I feel like I use all kinds of different skills on my job day to day, whether it be my statistical knowledge, my design of research projects, my teaching, interacting with students, even doing service work and consulting with the larger community. I do all kinds of different things, and so I use all my different skills. My task identity, I see things from the beginning to the end. And so for students like you, I see you at the beginning of the semester, I see you at the end of the semester, and I see you at graduation. And so I see you guys progress through kind of your career at NIU. In addition, from the research side of things, I see a project from the beginning when I come up with an idea or a colleague comes up with an idea, to doing the data analysis, to writing the thing, to seeing it get published from the start to the end. Task significance. I am very high on this. I feel like I'm making a small difference in the world. And it may not be for everyone that I'm teaching, but I feel like for some folks, maybe even a small subset, I'm making a small difference where I'm helping them see, you know what, I can be a better leader. I can inspire people. I can motivate people a little bit more. And then autonomy. I have freedom to do anything I want each day. Every day I wake up and I go, what do I want to work on today? It could be a research project. It could be designing a new class. It could be designing a new activity for class to make it more interesting for you. These are all things I get to focus on each day. And then finally, feedback. I get a ton of feedback in my job. I get feedback from you as the students on student evaluations. I get feedback on how you're performing on your projects throughout the semester. So I can see, okay, what kind of things do I need to focus on a little bit more? Which things do I need to focus a little bit less on? And then research, I get feedback all the time in terms of feedback on my publications. We get them reviewed by the journals and they say this is good or this needs to be improved and all sorts of things. And so because of that, you can see why I'm much, much, much more happy in the job I have now than what I had before. And again, this is something that all of us can do for ourselves. And it's definitely something you can do for your teammates and your employees. And one final thing about this. Let's go back to my Ford credit time. And let's say that I filled out the job diagnostic survey and I came up with this. And I had a terrible, terrible manager. And some of you are going to have terrible managers in your career. I can use this as a way of managing up, a way of leading my boss, because my boss doesn't know what they're doing when I was at Ford Credit. And so when I have my yearly performance appraisal with my boss, I could have went in and say, you know what, I could use more feedback. And here's why. This would help him provide me more feedback. I could bring up the discussion of having more autonomy and things I could do. I could talk about task significance with him. And so my boss could have become a better manager by me leading upwards. And so you can use this as a tool to get the feedback and job that you really desire and want. And with that said, this concludes Module 8. I wish you all the best. I hope you have a great rest of the day, and thanks for listening.